Welcome to the Rethinking Porn Addiction Show. This is a bittersweet episode for us because we can get into the details in a minute. But I looked at the calendar, and our first episode we recorded on September 30th of last year. So that means we've been doing this for like 7 months, almost on a weekly basis, give or take a few weeks where we've missed. And I think we've made a lot of progress. We've had many conversations. We've had many people reach out to us and tell us how much us sharing our stories have meant to them and how much they've learned about the 6 principles of sexual health and creating their own sexual health plan and discovering their own values around sexual health, and how these conversations that people have been having have helped them have personal breakthroughs and breakthroughs in their relationships. And that's amazing. That's an amazing thing to experience. And we feel like we've kind of come to a place in our journey just with our personal lives. Things have gotten a little bit more hectic. And with regards to the conversations that we've been having, it feels like we're getting to that point where we want to make sure that we're always providing interesting and engaging content for you. We don't want to become repetitive and redundant and boring. Just like, you know how I just said 3 things using the exact ways. As an example, I'm from the Department of Redundancy Department. Anyway, we decided to close the chapter on this format of the Rethinking Porn Addiction podcast for an undecided amount of time. It's definitely not a goodbye. This is an opportunity to kind of like close this chapter and then rethink how we want to continue to publish and share stories about rethinking porn addiction or other topics that kind of fall into this same bucket of sexual health. And so we'll definitely be back, but I think we need a little bit of a break to retool things. So this week, we're going to be sharing some of our biggest takeaways from the last 7 months of having these conversations, and maybe sharing a few personal stories. And hopefully this inspires you. Maybe this is your first episode that you've ever heard, or maybe you're jumping in halfway through the season to go back. We want to hope this inspires you to go back and start from the very beginning and maybe re-listen to these episodes and see how much you've grown, and also maybe be inspired to ask some really relevant questions and have some really powerful and meaningful conversations around sexual health. So with that said, with that teeing us off, Hans, you mentioned that you went back and rewatched our first episode over the last week.
I did.
Talk to me about that.
It was interesting. I honestly enjoyed watching a younger version of myself. It was really neat. And I thought to myself, in a way, I'm experiencing time travel right now. I went back and I just listened to myself talk and listened to all of us talk, and it was really neat. A bunch of stuff came out of it. I think for me, the overarching feeling was I could tell how nervous I was in that first show, and watching myself on the live recording or on the recording. I was actually feeling anxious for myself on the show as I was rewatching it. Anyway, it was really interesting, and I think the thing that stood out to me the very most was the sacredness, and maybe it's a good place for us to start. The sacredness and the value and the importance of people finding spaces to have conversations just to start. I re-listened to my own tale and Jake's tale, and Nate, your recounting of your journey with porn from a very young age. And one of the things that's really stood out was the fact that at young ages, none of us had anybody to talk to about it. And so we were navigating these difficult, troubled, shame-filled experiences without anybody to turn to or talk to. And that weighed really heavy on me. I guess one of the takeaways I have is really just the beauty and often the difficulty of finding spaces to have these conversations. Yeah. Doug, I know you've often said the price of entry into these conversations, particularly for cisgender men, is really high because it usually takes hurting somebody significantly or a criminal act or some other egregious event in order to be able to start having these conversations. And I think, if anything, I'm hoping our show has inspired maybe a few people to be like, hey, those are three normal dudes that are stumbling through conversations about sex and pornography, and maybe I can do that with somebody also.
One of the things I've been most inspired by all three of you is something I often say to so many. I train therapists around the country in how to do what you three men have demonstrated to do so beautifully without having to be in psychotherapy. Is I have to convince so many people that men know how to do what the three of you have done so beautifully in these conversations with each other and with Kristen and I. I think a lot of times men are underestimated about what the kind of vulnerability and honesty and how meaningful it is for them to have their experiences be heard and listened to. I so agree with you. From the first episode, I remember as well, Nate, you sharing your story. And I remember thinking at the time, those emotions were so, present in our discussion that day. And yet they had been so long ago, and how we get reminded that the body just carries these experiences as emotional energy for so long. And, that was one of the things I've really experienced in this program, is how many of your experiences have been, sort of carried by you emotionally alone, without really being spoken. And so I too, Hans, hope that some people who've been listening are inspired by the three of you and feel like, wow, I can do this. I don't have to wait.
Absolutely.
And I'll say some of the moments it on the lines of inspiring people, or for men to see this, is to see that couples can come from a really painful story, or they stumble upon something really difficult, and that you can move that experience and it can become a place of intimacy and strength. Like some of the experiences Jake and I had on this show, where I was Kristen the wife, not Kristen the therapist, were really authentic and organic in the moment. And hopefully, I think those have been my favorite moments for us to experience, that this doesn't have to be what defines our relationship. It's a part of it, but it's a part that no longer is the thing that shall not be named. It's like, it's part of our journey. It's part of our story. Like, wow, how much did we learn, and how much have we grown, and looking at our younger selves of where we were. And I think for couples, just to have an example that you really can shift into a different space.
Yeah. That feeling stuck isn't permanent.
Yeah.
That feeling disconnected isn't permanent. That feeling a sense of mistrust isn't permanent. And I was having a conversation with a young man earlier today that told me that he's engaged, and he just kind of told his fiance that he slipped up and looked at pornography again, and he is changing his language around it, and they're having a conversation about what the future of their relationship looks like right now. And they're great sexual health conversations. But one of the things that I just realized talking to this young man is that when you have these sexual health conversations, it helps you. And I think this is a combination of these conversations and then this book I'm reading right now, which is called "I Love You, But I Don't Trust You," by Mira Kirschenbaum. And one of the things that's been popping up a lot is that you are not defined by the mistakes that you make. And I think it's really easy. One of the themes that I've noticed in my life and throughout these conversations is when you're in that deep, dark shame pit, a lot of the times the temptation is to define yourself by the things that you hate most about yourself, by your shortcomings, your mistakes, your sins, your faults, your flaws. like that becomes how you see yourself, is you are those things. And I think through having these sexual health conversations, it creates space between the choices that you make and then who you are as a person. And when you start having these sexual health conversations as a partnership, it helps you see your partner as a more complete version of themselves instead of just the thing that hurts you about them. And I think, Kristen, you and Jake modeled that a lot. I've seen people repeat this over and over again, and I've come back to it over and over again. That moment in the episode a while back where you said, I had to decide whether or not I wanted Jake to be who I needed him to be in order for me to feel comfortable, or if I wanted him to be exactly who he was, and if I could tolerate that and love him for exactly who he was, including the darkness, including the shadow, including the things that may not be ideal about him. And Jake mentioned that the moment that he felt like you chose him for exactly who he was the moment that like he came alive. And there's something powerful in seeing your partner for everything that they are and accepting them and realizing that their faults don't define their value. And yeah.
That Doug said something that was very profound to me in discussing the idea of betrayal, and that betrayal is a feeling, a moment in time, not an identity. And Doug, clarify if I've got that wrong, but that you don't have, that I don't have to take on the identity of betrayed, but that was a profound feeling at one point in time, but not who I am forevermore. Yes. And that's very freeing to explore it from that standpoint instead of so.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I've seen the three of you talk about. I'm speaking about Nate, Jake, and Hans. Is this idea that whatever your relationship was with sexual imagery, that at one time was sort of labeled not only as sort of like an addictive process, but that you also had to take on an identity as a porn addict. And that it seems like that's been an important part of the narrative in all of our conversations, is how to talk about your relationship to sexual imagery without your relationship to sexual imagery having to become some sort of identity that you have. And not just an identity of the past, but a kind of an identity going forward, which was also part of the discussion we've had here. And, I think the three of you have done such a nice job of just sort of talking about how you sort of moved through and past that kind of identity that was sort of one that was either given to you or you felt like you had to take on.
Can I ask a question about that? This is a Doug and Kristen question. I find that I think people find a lot of reassurance in creating their identity around something like that. Like, whether it's like an eating disorder, or whether it's like maybe you've been sexually assaulted or raped, or maybe you're dealing with, like, there's so many things that people deal with in their life. And I find that many times people identify themselves with the thing, like maybe it's a mental health issue like depression or anxiety, and they take that on as an identity, whether it's porn addict, rape survivor, a depressed person. Like, why do we do that? Why do we take something that we're struggling with and make it essentially mean who we are, make it part of our identity? And is that a bad thing? Like,
I'll just sort of say the first thing that comes to my mind, because I've written about this and talked about it, is that I find that this model of sort of seeing oneself as having this identity initially is associated with hope. That without sort of taking on that identity, without sort of embracing that identity, there doesn't, that when you take on that identity, it's a way forward. There's a method of therapy. There's a method of maybe a community of support. There's relationships. There's a reduction in shame because other than maybe having a disease, the only alternative is there's something deviant or something terribly wrong with you, and that's judged even more harshly than having, let's say, an addictive process. So, initially it can be quite relieving and quite meaningful for people. But as we've talked about in the show, it doesn't mean it's accurate, but it's very meaningful.
Thank you. That provides a little clarity for me. Do you find that sometimes people are nervous to let go of that identity because
Oh, well, we have 3 experts right in the room who can.
That's what I was just going to say. Turn it to them.
Answer that question.
Turn it to them.
Right
and maybe I do volley this. Let's volley this to Jake and Hans. Like, is it difficult to let go of that identity? And if it is, why do you think? Why was it difficult for you to let go of the addict label? Was it scary? Was it? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm curious.
I don't know. I don't know if Hans has ever been labeled as a porn addict before.
Hans, have you ever like labeled yourself as an addict? Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I used that language about myself for a while. Yeah.
Great. So we're all in the same boat. At least we all have thought ourselves in this way.
Yeah.
I think mine was maybe a label given to me and one that never felt accurate. And it definitely didn't feel like there was any hope associated. It felt like a limited language to describe my situation. And then as that terminology was used more and more, it was usually in a negative connotation, and I took on the negative aspect of that label. And it felt tremendously freeing to be let go of it. And it's also interesting, is something that I initially probably rejected, maybe because of shame or whatever else that I'd put around it, how difficult it was to sort of let it go. Not in a sort of excuse sort of way, but more of I had begun to view myself through that lens so much that it sort of just was sticking, like all things that we continue to do. And, you know, as we were talking about, this is the last sort of episode we're going to do, and what we're kind of our thoughts, I was thinking about what I learned, but then also if someone came up to me and said, you know, is it worth it? Is it worth it to go talk to your partner? Is it worth it to go through the effort to try to figure out this sexual health conversations and to go approach a buddy, first of all, or to learn about the different things? And what I would go back and tell to someone who's about to listen to the show for the first time. But then I actually took it a little further and say, would I go back and tell that to myself as a young newlywed that was really, really grappling in the midst of all this? And it was, the answer I kind of came up with is the burden and the weight of carrying this label and of being entrenched in that shame cycle, Nate, which you brought up, is far heavier than anything that, at least for me, could come afterwards. And you kind of touched on it. It was because I became alive when, you know, Chris knew everything and we were in this together, and yeah, she was angry. She was all of these different things, but it was so tremendously freeing. And I cannot stress that enough, to not have to carry secrecy or shame or any of this other stuff around it. And it helped me to start to realize and to kind of break through that label and that lens that I had come to associate myself with, this addict label. And it was like, wow, I'm not an addict. And, you know, the whole experience shifted. And then as I went back and thought about our journey on this process and you know, since September or whatever, it was the kind of takeaways I had were, one, there were so many things that I didn't know because I had never even had a space or thought to discuss some of those things. And it's all sexually related. There were so many things that through our conversations or side conversations or starting to talk about this more, that it gave me a chance to understand greater insights into who I am and what I believe and how I feel. And there is no other way I could have gained those insights. There's just not a forum or a place to do that, at least in my lifetime. And then the second was that it's a process. And for me, when I let go of the control of having the outcome be a certain way, which was usually to comfort or to minimize my pain, or the pain I was causing other. But as soon as I let go of control and just kind of went into it, because I knew this is the journey we were on and we had to be going down this, is when it really started to open up. And things looked a lot different than I thought they would, but it was so much better for our relationship and for who I was as a person. And so to someone who's out there that's, kind of thinking about this or listening to this and going, well, my situation, I think we've all been in some sort of your situation. And yes, your situation is definitely different than mine or Hans's or Nate's or anyone else's. But I do believe there's enough similarities that if you have, sort of faith in the process and you're willing to be honest and put yourself out there, that it is so, so, so incredibly worth it. And your relationship with your spouse and your relationship with yourself will change in ways that are going to be unlike anything you could possibly imagine. And I believe for the better.
Jake, one of the stories you told us here that I've often thought of and remembered was how you talked about the relief of being discovered, that it was now over.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a meaningful story to be told here. That there was a toll for you in the waiting for this part of your life to just be known, seen. Now it's out.
Yeah. And all of my worst nightmares that were for sure going to come true when I was discovered or when it came out, none of them happened. Mm-hmm. Not a single one. Yes, there was pain and there was shame and lots of conversations to sort through and to pull through. And there was so much discomfort. But there was healing. And there was honesty, and there was a chance to, there was a chance to, instead of paddling upstream, and you could just turn around and swim right into the arms of, and I'm fortunate that Chris was that way, but I mean, it does go back to that authentic self and being loved for who you are, not for who you are trying to show up to be if it's not with integrity to your partner. So thank you for Doug for saying that, because I think I need to be reminded of that more often, and how, it's hard. It's super, super hard, and it feels so good. And it felt so good. It's like that nausea feeling you're feeling before you throw up, and then you throw up and you're like, this was this terrible experience. And I feel so much better now in my body and in my soul and everywhere in me. I feel so much better now getting that out of me.
So I'm curious, Hans and Nate, about the identification as porn addict, or that label, so that we keep on that thread with each of you for a minute.
Something we haven't talked about much here, but just came out in Jake's sharing, is the idea of finally being able to love yourself. I think for me anyway, carrying that label or any label, really, there's some comfort in it, because you get into these cycles of knowing how you are going to be treated and knowing how you're going to feel about yourself, that are repeatable, and that there's some comfort in. And there's a whole lot of fear when you think about breaking those, and like Jake said, going into an unknown space where there's just a lot of discomfort and you don't know where it's going to land. But I honor, and through other experiences over the past 6 or 7 months also, and thinking back, Nate, to your story, really one of your stories that you shared early on, and shed tears over, about the amount of loneliness that you felt, having labeled yourself either as a porn addict or not being able to escape it, or the shame that was carried with that. And you talked about being open and honest for the first time about it, and being your authentic self, I think, or true to yourself for the first time. That process of allowing myself to fully admit and embrace who I am and be authentic with myself, I think is the key, or one of the keys to what Jake was just sharing about letting go of the weight, that immense weight that will always be there until you take that step. So letting go of the labels for me was part of that process of, okay, this is my authentic self, and I'm going to figure out how to love myself. And then I hope I'm going to be lucky enough to be with other people who love me for my authentic self also.
So I just have a follow-up question. If you don't identify as a porn addict, where does sexual imagery now fit? Like, what is the new space that's been occupied by that label?
That's a great question, Nate. Jake's talked. Do you want to share? If not, I can share what my thoughts are now.
Go for it, man. If you got a thought, share it.
My response to that is, and really it's in gratitude, with much gratitude to what Doug has shared. And one of the other things that I noticed is back at the very beginning, I said, as we started the show, I felt compelled, or I felt it important to say, I'm in this process still myself. Like, I'm still on this journey. I'm still moving down the path. And I say that exact same thing today still. I'm still on this path, just moving through a journey. And the piece that's fallen into place for me since our first conversations is the paradigm of the 6 principles of sexual health, and viewing not only sexual imagery, but the entirety of my sexual being through the lens of sex is beautiful and amazing and pleasurable, and it should be that. And the ability to approach that still with those very comforting guidelines or principles of honesty and non-exploitation and shared values. I can't remember the other 3 now, but they're there. The idea of having, what's that, Nate?
Pleasure.
That's right. Pleasure.
It's an important one.
The idea of having that paradigm to view sexual imagery or sexual engagement with somebody else, or solo sex with myself, or any of those pleasurable sexual experiences through that lens, as opposed to, oh, this is porn and you're an addict or you're not an addict, but where does this fit with myself with regard to my values and the 6 principles of sexual health? And how do I want to approach this or not approach this? We talked a lot about a moral floor. I think it was amazing for me. That's another amazing thing that came out of our conversations, to say, hey, look at my moral floor. These are the things that I'm okay with, and that when I think about the 6 principles of sexual health, that they fall in line with my personal values or my morals. And I can navigate these waters now, knowing I have morals and values, and I have these 6 really helpful guidelines of sexual health that I can look at sexual imagery or other things through now, and find peace and find meaning and my spot in that way, as opposed to just the more common and easily thrown about labels that are out there.
I love how your face brightened up, Hans, when you told us about the ability to embrace the 6 principles of sexual health as a way to guide and be kind of your rudder for your sexual life now, versus, is this an addiction or not an addiction? You not only said the words, but you're literally, your face changed as you shifted from that old lens to this more current lens.
It really is empowering. And maybe I'll leave with empowering, to think about my sexual being in that way, as opposed to having to judge it by, and we've talked about this, by some external authorities that say you're this or this. But to be able to internalize those principles and my own values and morals has been immensely powerful experience for me.
So Nate, how are you wanting to reflect on your experience here, and particularly in relation to Kristen's question?
Yeah. Just thinking back on those days before I was exposed to what we're doing here, in my teens and 20s, the only language I had to describe somebody who had a problem with viewing sexual imagery, and it was problematic, was addict. That was it. So whether that was once every 6 months or 6 times a day, it didn't matter, or anywhere in between. It didn't matter what that was, what, like how often or frequent or out of control the behavior was. It was an addiction. And I just remember in the back of my mind fearing, just having so much shame and fearing that my parents would find out, or that my siblings would find out, or that a girl that I was dating would find out. And there's this narrative in the back of my head all throughout that stage of life of what woman in her right mind would ever want to marry somebody who came attached with this label of addict. I don't know a woman on earth who's excited to marry a guy who defines as an addict. And if you know anything about me, like, marriage is something that I really wanted. It's something that I sought after. And I think a huge impediment to me getting married, I didn't marry until my 30s, which is old for the culture that we come from. Not necessarily in maybe the world standard, but from the religion that I come from, many of my friends were getting married in their early 20s, some even like just fresh out of high school. And it's just really common. And I was wondering if there was something wrong with me. And I think that played a huge role in me putting off marriage. And the relief that I felt in realizing that I wasn't an addict was like, oh, huge weight lifted off my shoulders. And being able to engage in conversations about my sexual desires and my sexual self through a framework of principles allowed me so much more freedom to get curious about who I am and what brings me pleasure and what I like and what my limits are, and have conversations with my partner, with my wife. And like, it's just so freeing and amazing. And so I think it's scary at first to set aside, to kind of like, I don't know, the vision I'm having in my mind right now is just like taking a big deep breath and looking at the word addict and being like, no, like, you are not me. And stepping out of that space, not knowing now who you are, like, it's scary. How do I explain this problem to people who in my life who might need to know, without using that word that I don't feel like defines me? These conversations have helped me have that language. And it's really cool to see other people start adopting that language too, and the smile that comes on their face. Just even this week, I was having a conversation with a guy, and he goes, I've been addicted to porn. And then he stopped and he goes, I've experienced pornography problems. And then he smiled. And I don't think he even noticed it, but I was like, bro, you're not an addict. Like you're not, if you had a slip up, you're not an addict. You know what I mean? If you're not looking, anyway, I don't want to be the one who defines it, but it was clear that this guy was not like putting his serious relationships and his job and his health in jeopardy because of his relationship with sexual imagery. He was just a guy who wanted some pleasure in his life and was probably under a lot of stress and whatever. And just seeing the smile come across his face, I was like, okay, this guy's been listening and he's been engaging. And I could see how freeing these conversations have been when you start to adapt a new language and now I'm Nate. Like, that's who I am. I'm Nate, and I have values, and I have sexual values. I'm not an addict. I have new language for it.
So as we say goodbye in this last episode, now that each of you have shared this, think of the men out there that they may never have a conversation with somebody like with Nate or Jake or Hans, but they might have some experience of freedom, liberation, some sense of an alternative way forward, that the only way to talk about this, distressing or problem situation around use of sexual imagery for pleasure, they may also have those moments of feeling liberated and feeling, relieved, and we're never going to know. We just have to believe that, somehow these conversations may lead somebody to feel this way.
Yeah.
And I like to think about that going forward as the show's coming to an end. I've watched each of you share so many memorable moments that it's been meaningful for you. And so as a therapist, when I would have those moments with clients, now that I'm no longer a therapist, I like to think about the fact that people I maybe had interactions with are taking their experience with me forward into other relationships that will have meaning. And I hope that's the same, that some men out there are going to, and whoever is going to have some experience differently with themselves, experience themselves differently, because you've all taken the time to have these conversations.
I love it. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I liked your story a lot, and what it made me think of, wanting to put a pin in one more aspect with regard to the label or the addict paradigm, is that paradigm is very confining and doesn't allow for talking or learning or growth. It's like you're an addict, and that's how we define you and approach you and engage you. And it really does not allow for any of the beauty that can come out of talking about it, learning about it, growing from it. And that is also acknowledging the fact that it can be an out of control behavior. So it is a very real problem for people. And I don't want to downplay that in the least. And I also want to allow for people that are in that journey at some point the ability to have space to talk and learn and grow. And it takes stepping away from that addict label to be able, I think, to do that. And hearing your story about your buddy saying, yeah, I've had problems with it, and I'm not an addict, is a really cool space for him to be able to grow into. Like, I can hear in that story, I could hear him growing or expanding in some way to say, oh, I'm looking at this in new ways. I can talk about it. I can explore it. I can see what my boundaries really are, where they need to be, what boundaries I want to have, and explore that, as opposed to just the quick label that sets you on a path that there's no room for growth or exploration.
Love that, Hans.
So, for me, when Chrissy asked that question, I just did the simple guy and I wrote down like the 3 first labels that came to my mind. And it was partner, normal, and human. And those are so incredibly different than an addict. And kind of going to what you just said, Hans, of like, as a partner, it's something I want to be better at, something I'm constantly working at. And normal was this sort of freeing of, it just, in my mind, it was the shedding of the shame that we've talked about earlier.
Yeah.
That human, it was the more I've learned and the more knowledge I've received, that developmentally I'm kind of right on track with where I should be, which is, in my mind, the human experience.
You're a human having a human experience, and that is beautiful and perfect.
Yeah.
I think something I want to reflect to you 3 and as possibly other listeners is something that I have found remarkable is your willingness to figure this out in real time, trying to describe internal experiences or things you've had without having the language yet. And initially being like, oh, I'm not saying this right, or it's not. And then all of a sudden being like, wait, I'm just like this. You didn't have years of language to describe your experiences and have it reflected and validated. And that, I think that's another thing I've seen all of you grow is you're describing all of your experiences and reflecting on it with newfound language to express an experience. And I think that's remarkable, doing it live for other people to witness your process and to witness the possible missteps or trying on a concept. And I think that's been really neat to watch and witness and hear. And I think as a therapist or as people will reach out, they're like, I'm not saying this right, or I'm sorry if this, and I think I've learned that from Doug and Doug, you have a phrase that you say that I have internalized of, I'm just going to lob that over to you. What's that phrase that is like?
Oh, I wish I could read your mind right now, Kristen.
It's the one where it's like, you're doing it great. You're saying it wonderfully. When men are like, I didn't say that well, or I don't know what to say. You have this beautiful way of saying you're doing great instead of stilting the conversation because you don't have the language or it's not perfected yet. And so you don't have that conversation, the willingness to meet yourself where you are and finding the language and expression and all that. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to figure it out right now with you all.
Yeah, right. I don't have a particular sentence coming to mind, but I love the fact that you're remembering the spirit of my intent in those moments.
Yeah.
It's really important for men to move into trying to describe their experience. Maybe you're thinking anything worth doing is worth doing lousy at first. I don't know if that was what the one you were referring to, but it is awkward and it's difficult. And I think it's important to honor men who are willing to be awkward in the name of improving their sexual health. I just think that's a very honorable space to move into.
If I can remember Doug by one phrase going forward, it will be, and how was that for you? That's
and
the
what
question
would you like to say that out loud?
I think every episode we've recorded, you'd stop one of us and say, and Jake, how was that for you? And Hans, how was that for you? And Nate, how was that for you when that happened? And I think that question is like such a great question that we can all take with us going forward as we have these conversations. It's helping yourself and your not letting your partner off the hook without like really hearing their experience. Mm-hmm. Oh, this thing happened. And, oh, okay. And how was that for you? I looked at pornography again. And how was that for you? My parents shamed me growing up. And how was that for you? Mm-hmm. I felt like I had to hide myself when it came to church. And how was that for you? Like that question just encourages people to open up and share their story. And I think that is like the Dougism that is just going to be branded in my brain that I'll go to throughout the rest of my life.
Well, the word that comes to mind that you're describing is how warm we feel when somebody is curious without judgment.
Yeah.
That's such a lovely human space when two people or more can occupy it together. And, that's my intent in those moments, is to somehow say, let's be curious without being evaluative. Let's be curious without drawing a conclusion. Let's be curious without giving labels. And I really appreciate you, Nate, saying, I liked being there. I liked being invited into that place.
Definitely. So can I flip the question back on Doug and Kristen? Because you two played a very unique role in the last 20 some odd conversations that we've had. You're both clinicians. Kristen, you obviously you're the only person in the room that we know of who has a partner who has dealt with this stuff, and you have kind of played the female role. So just looking backwards on the last 20 some odd episodes that we've recorded, what do you hope people take away from these the Rethinking Porn Addiction podcast up till now?
Do you want to go first, Doug?
Oh, I think he asked you first.
You asked me first? Okay.
Do we need to have a game of rock, paper, scissors live?
No. I think for me is the biggest takeaway is hope and an invitation to be able to explore an issue that I think has become pretty commonplace in another way, that there's more ways that you could start to explore that. I think for me, one of the things I've learned is this isn't to be in conflict or to tear down another model, but to say there's additional ways that you can explore this, think about this, approach this, talk about it. And to me, that's very hopeful, because I think sometimes people can get stuck. And that would be my biggest takeaway, is that people have spent time with everybody in this room and to go, okay, there is light at the end of this tunnel for me, and we can get through this. So I think hope and seeing that.
Yeah. For me, I think that what comes to mind is almost all of the conversations I've had in my entire adult professional life with men concerned about their out of control sexual behavior has been in a specific relationship dynamic. One person is a client, and I'm working in the role as a paid professional, as a mental health professional, and providing psychotherapy. And this experience has been so meaningful to me that I'm not in that role here. I mean, I know about the topic, but that's not the role we have with each other here. And it's been so meaningful for me to engage in just adult conversations. We each have our own wisdom we bring to the situation, but we've had just adult conversations here where we listen to each other and learn from each other. And I hope men who've listened and people who've listened to our podcast take forward that these can be adult conversations. They don't have to be psychotherapy conversations. And I hope that's something some people feel inspired by, the generosity of the three of you and the five of us showing up every week here is too often things get thought of as only can happen in therapy. And I think we give some people, we underestimate the capacity of some people when we privilege those spaces as where humans can connect in the way we have here. And so that's how I guess I think of it, Nate, is going forward. Is I hope people think they could engage in a conversation like we've had here without only having to be in a psychotherapy office.
Thank you both.
Doug, I felt what you were saying, and it echoed what I had been thinking for a few minutes about something else I learned. And that is, Kristen, actually, you started talking about it. The idea of giving each other space here. It's been great practice for me. Having been in places in my life where I want to have a safe space to talk, it's also really important for me to give other people a space safe to talk and to just hear their experiences and allow them that space. I think I feel like it's a non-traditional masculine trait to just be soft and listen or to share vulnerably. And thinking back to where I was at when we started these conversations, where I am now, I would hope people find maybe just a bit more bravery to step into those conversations and be willing to break down maybe a concept of what it means to be a man or to be tough or to have your shit together. Like, to be able to let go of those a little bit and be able to step into a conversation, both sharing and also listening and receiving, is something that I hope people take away from this also.
Mm-hmm. Hans, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I'm just reflecting now, one of the things I've so enjoyed about our weekly conversations is watching the three of you listen to each other. Well, what about you, Jake? What are you thinking right now? Or, Nate, you haven't had a chance to talk. Or Hans, what are you thinking about? And that the three of you have demonstrated a kind of mutual respect and interest in each other's experience and creating a space for that. A lot of times men don't necessarily know how to do that quite so effectively. Yeah. I've really enjoyed watching the three of you be interested in each other in a very genuine way.
Yeah, we're pretty awesome, aren't we?
You are.
I'm feeling a bit of inspiration, Doug. Maybe, so I've thought, as we've been going through these conversations, I've been thinking to myself, what can we really offer people to take away? Like, what's a takeaway that someone can go out and get value from their life? And I'm thinking to myself, there are people that are listening to this show who need those spaces to talk, or are desiring them, or are lonely, or are full of shame right now. And those spaces are hard to find. And maybe one good way to find those spaces is to actually be that space for somebody else. So to give someone else that opportunity to talk is maybe one of the best ways that you could actually find it for yourself also. I guess I'm hoping for anyone listening that is in a dark spot that they might be able to go out and be that space for somebody else. And there's the possibility that you'll have practice there, and maybe it will come back to you and be a safe space for you to start to unpack and navigate some of these conversations also.
Mhm.
You're a good man, Hans.
I'm in a room of really good people, Nate. And thank you. I will accept that. I won't deflect that.
I love that. I like how you caught yourself, Hans. Good for you. That was great to see.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Nate. It means a lot.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time knowing like how to wrap this up. I wish I could sit here and talk to you guys for a really long time, but
well, one of the things that's happening right now that I like to talk about with all the group therapy sessions I ran for 27 years is that it's rare in, I think, our experience to say goodbye to relationships that work.
Yeah.
Most of our life, relationships either sort of fizzle out, or we become distant, or there's a conflict, or there's some injury, or something that unexpected leads to the ending or the distance. But here we are in this room. I just delight in each one of you, and yet we're saying goodbye to this way of being together. And I always just sort of like to acknowledge that at times like this. This isn't typically the circumstances we say goodbye.
yeah. I think if anything, maybe one thing that we should consider doing is starting an Instagram account just so we can get updates on Jake's facial hair. Because anytime it changes, he can post so we can all know.
So people that are on the podcast are going to have to tune into the YouTube station to see what you're talking about, Nate.
Yeah.
And Jake, you should take it right there, that exact square frame that I'm seeing right now, just sit in front of your camera each time, and that should be an Instagram post.
Do a time lapse.
Which is often.
So does anybody else have a final thought or something that you want to leave our listeners with before we end our conversation in this chapter of the podcast?
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Those of you in this room and those of you listening, the reason we're doing this is because you listen, and we hope some people have found this meaningful as they've listened. So thank you all.
Absolutely. So just a heads up for the future. We do finally have the Rethinking Porn Addiction podcast, all the episodes up on iTunes. So if you want to go back and listen, you can listen to them there, or on Spotify, or on YouTube, or in the Facebook group. You can go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com to find additional resources, including links to Doug's book and some more professional workshops that he's done, some links to some courses that Kristen has put together about how to talk to your kids about porn and masturbation and other things like that, and lots of other resources. And we'll continue to keep that updated. And this will not be the last time that we go live on this feed either. I fully expect that we'll be back with more content down the road in a different format that will be useful and maybe provide some different perspectives and points of view. And we would love to provide some. We're talking about providing some other resources for you as well, which we'll let you know about when they become available. So this is not the end of this group working together. This is not the last time you'll hear from us, but it may be the last time you hear from us in this specific format with the 5 of us all together having conversations every single week. So thank you for being a part of this journey. RethinkingPornAddiction.com is where you can find more information. And if you ever have questions, please reach out. We're always happy to point you in a direction where you can find solutions to your problems and connection and community. And we'll do our best to provide resources like that for you down the line. All right, guys, let's log off. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
y'all.